Hi everyone, and welcome to another lecture. Today we're going to talk about an introduction section, and this is part of your basic research or typical research paper, and it's the first part actually. So a typical scientific paper has an introduction, a method section, a results section, a discussion section, and a conclusion. In the introduction section, we find that this is where we're going to present the scope of a problem or the general broad topic, the research question and hypotheses, and the literature review. We wait until the method section to talk about procedures, participants, or analysis of what we either are intending to do if we're proposing this or what we have done. And then, of course, the results and discussion. That's where we're going to, after we've done our research, that's where we're going to present our results in tables and figures and in our writing, and then we're going to discuss all the results and our findings. So we're just going to stick today to talking about the introduction section though. So we're going to go over the scope of the problem, the research question and hypotheses, and the literature review. The scope of the problem or the topic. So let's start off by thinking about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And this reminds me of The Wizard of Oz and Follow the Yellow Brick Road. When you are writing an introduction, you want to create a pathway of your thought processes that led you to choosing the research you did. Create the path for the reader to understand why you questioned what you are hoping to answer through your research. This is a really critical thing to understand. You're not just doing this to impress a professor or to just finish an assignment. You want to create and make that pathway for people to understand what you were thinking and what led you to what you're doing. So how do we do this? Well, first we want to start off by talking about the broad general statements that capture the overarching topic that you want to introduce. And next you want to offer additional information, definitions, background, any sort of evidence, maybe previous research about the topic or problem. And this will help the reader to understand the complete picture of the problem. And then as you've started to define the problem or kind of explain what's going on, kind of introduce the general topic, you want to start to narrow down. You want to get your discussion a little bit more focused on the problem that needs to be researched, which is going to be just a piece, just one tiny piece of a much larger problem. But because you've started out generally and you've narrowed it down, you've kind of let the reader understand what the importance is. You've been able to highlight why this is important. And always keep in mind that most likely when you do research, you've probably spent weeks or months or sometimes years working on your research. And this is something that has become common knowledge to you, the language around it and some of the underlying assumptions that everyone can make when they're in that field. But oftentimes what you and your colleagues consider to be common knowledge might be something that's unknown to your readers. So be careful when you're writing that you're clear and you're considering, is this something that everyone knows or just the people in my tribe, and the people in my field. The voice you use when you're writing scientific papers is very different than what we've learned up until now. Oftentimes we've learned to add transitions and to make things a little bit more whimsical. And in scientific writing, it's a little bit more abrupt. It's very direct, but it's concise. It's quick, it's direct, it's clear, it's detailed, and we're very selective about what's important and what's not important. And you have to kind of think a little bit critically about, does this something that the reader needs to know? And you have to determine that. So we need to be aware as we write. But when we start to master combining all of these things, our voice becomes very confident. And it's pretty neat to see at the end. Just a quick example of an introduction section. I'm just going to read the first paragraph of this. And as I'm reading it, see if you can hear how it's kind of starting to start very broad and then kind of narrow a little. This one actually takes a page or two, but this gives you a good start. So over the past half century, changes in mortality rates and disease onset have led to an increase in active life expectancy. Coupled with the development of pharmaceutical treatments for sexual dysfunction, there's a large and growing population of older adults for whom sexuality remains an important feature of life, despite physiological changes that may lead to a decline in sexual functioning. In a recent national study of 9,164 men and women over the age of 50, more than 85% agreed that it is important to have an exciting sex life. Additionally, Flynn and Gao recently demonstrated that frequency of sexual activity is an important predictor of life satisfaction among older adults. So I'll just go ahead and stop there. But I don't know if you can tell, but we're actually getting towards here is they've kind of limited it down, and we're discussing sex life, frequency, and satisfaction among older adults. But the start of it is talking about just your basic mortality rates are changing, people are living longer, that there's been a development in pharmaceutical treatments for sexual dysfunction. So you're starting off very broad, but again, you're creating that pathway as to why this is becoming important and what the thought process was. All of these things coupled together, and of course that 85% of the people are claiming that this is an important part of their life. This is something that needs to be studied. So right here, we're kind of pointing out the importance of why we're doing this, why they're doing this study. Once you've done this, you want to then propose or present your research question and your hypotheses. Now, notice real quick, I'll digress just a little, but the word hypotheses ends in an SES, and that is because it is plural. So if you're presenting just one hypothesis, a null hypothesis or an alternative hypothesis, that would be SIS. But when we're presenting or discussing more than one, it's hypotheses and it's plural. So I just wanted to kind of run that by you real quick. So a research question is a question that seeks to answer if there's a relationship between variables. And it's going to ask if one variable influences another, affects another, impacts another, if one variable, if they have a relationship, if one causes something. That's the basic gist of a research question. And research questions can be applied, causal, or basic. Your basic research question has the goal of solving everyday problems, whereas a causal research question asks what causes maybe a specific behavior to occur. So they're a little bit different, but they all are still considered a research question. And it depends upon, again, what you're trying to answer and what you're working with and what field you're in. But whenever a research question is asked, then there are possible hypotheses that can be answered. So a hypothesis is basically, in its simplest form, a possible answer to the research question. There are two types of hypotheses. You have a null hypothesis and you have an alternative or a research, or sometimes even called a scientific hypothesis. A null hypothesis will always be that nothing is happening, that there's no relationship, there's no difference, there's no influence, no impact, no effect. The null hypothesis is saying in general that there's nothing happening between these variables. So if we want to know, does watching too many TV hours influence a student's GPA? Well, the null hypothesis would be no, that watching too many TV hours does not influence a person's GPA. So it's going to say that nothing's happening between the two variables. Now, an alternative, also known as a research hypothesis, is going to say that something is happening between the two variables. And you could say that quite possibly the more TV that someone watches, the better the grades they're going to get. Or you could say the more TV that someone watches, the worse grades they're going to get. Or you could say that the more, that just the variable of watching TV and the variable of grade, there is a relationship there. That one does, they do correlate, they have a relationship, or one does affect the other. So there's a few different ways you could answer that alternative hypothesis. And as a researcher, you would select one. When we're presenting our research, we present our research question, we discuss what the null is, and then we say what we are going to hypothesize as our research, as our person speaking about our research. Another way to think of the null hypothesis is it's the statement of equality between the sets of variables. So they're saying that the variables are similar or equal. They're not different from each other. Or, of course, the alternative to that would be it's a statement of inequality between the two variables. Let's look at some examples. So some example research questions. How does an authority figure influence behavior? Well, I don't know if any of you all recognize that, but that was Stanley Milgram in 1963. His study was interested in authority figures and the influence it has on behavior. His null hypothesis would be that an authority figure does not influence behavior, and that would just, that's what it is. The alternative is that it does influence behavior, that authority figure does influence behavior. So that's starting to make sense now, hopefully. Let's try another one. Can the petal of a saffron plant be an effective treatment in mild depression? Well, for those of you in my class, I've forced you to read this journal article. It's actually really interesting. But the null hypothesis for this would be that the petal of a saffron plant is not an effective treatment for mild depression. And the alternative or research hypothesis would be that it is an effective treatment in mild depression. And our final research question, is this the most exciting video you've seen this year? And I don't even think we need to do research on this. I'm pretty positive that you all would say yes, because introduction sections rock. Sorry, I have to do something to stay awake. So after we've introduced the scope of our problem and we've discussed the previous literature, we've talked about we discussed some previous literature to provide evidence for our general topic or explanations or definitions, and we've introduced our research question and our hypotheses. Now we want to get into our actual literature review, where we're going to go over many articles that are in the field that have led us to where we are and why we're questioning what we're questioning. One thing that I heard years ago when I started out in college, which was a long time ago, was Sir Isaac Newton's saying of, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is sort of very analogous to how science works. So people do research and then someone comes along and kind of completes what they weren't able to do in that original study. So if somebody has in a topic or a field studied, you have a team that studied A and now they're studying B and now they're studying C and D, I could come along and then pick up and study E, and people after me would study F. And eventually we all study these tiny parts of the research that create a complete understanding of something. Research takes several years. If you take a broad topic that most of us know about, maybe something like climate change, you have people that are studying the air, you have people that are studying the water, you have people that are studying health, you have people that are studying the germs and bugs and things like this. You have people, I mean, there's just hundreds and hundreds of people that are studying all small pieces, but they're combining it and they're sharing it, and the field itself is growing and growing. So that is how science works, and we stand on the shoulders of giants, or we actually, those who come before us are giving us so much knowledge. And this is how a literature review actually works. So a literature review creates that foundation, scope, or background for what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. It's also going to offer the evidence for what is known, and it's going to highlight the gaps for what's not known. So if we notice, again, go back to climate change, if everyone's studying air and water and people's behaviors, but no one's studying maybe lunar cycles, or, and I'm sorry, I'm just not in that field, but if no one's studying lunar cycles or animal behavior or soils, then we're missing pieces. So you want to continue to add where we're missing. So when we do a literature review, it also highlights where those gaps are, and that's very important. When you're doing your literature review, you want to organize your literature, and you want to put them into the kind of sectioned areas for each topic of your literature. So let's go back to the article of the saffron petal plant and whether or not that would help with mild depression. You may have 20 articles that you want to use as evidence and as your literature review. You might have 4 or 5 articles just on defining and describing what depression is. You might have 4 or 5 articles on defining and describing what some alternative medicine and public health practices might be. You might have a couple of articles defining and describing what saffron plant is from a chemistry and physiological standpoint, maybe some effects that it has on the human body. So you would have these kind of sectioned off, so where it makes logical sense. And the only way I can describe how you need to do this is it's gonna vary, and it's gonna depend on what question it is you're asking and how you're trying to tell the story or create your argument. But it will be very natural when you start to work on something and you're really been working on it for a few months. It will make sense, and these things need to be organized so that then again you can tell that story and create that pathway for your reader. As you break it down into each of the individual literature articles, and you're doing them one by one, you want to talk about who did they study, what did they do, how did they do it, what were their results, and what were their limitations. And this is exactly what you want to do with all of those 20 articles. You want to go over who did they study, what did they do, how did they do it, what were their results, and what were their limitations. And this way you're kind of synthesizing all of that previous literature and evidence for the reader so that they can, again, understand how important your work is and where your work fits and what you're going to gain and what you'll be able to contribute from your work. And I just want to point out this picture because I just love it. But this is research at its finest. It's just tons and tons of different pieces that all fit together to create one huge, large, important body of knowledge. If you start in the middle here, this is an article that was on about co-housing, and I kind of took it in the middle. There's about 1.5 pages of literature review, but I just wanted to grab a piece so you could kind of see the way that they set this argument up. Merkel et al. Compared co-housers with demographically similar individuals who were interested in co-housing, recruited from a U.S. National Co-housing Conference. Their aim was to assess levels of social support. They found that co-housers gave and received more socially supportive behaviors compared to their peers who were not living in co-housing, though other aspects of perceived social support did not differ. Finally, Boyer and Leland conducted a study with similar aims to the present study, to the present research. They collected data via the 2016 Cooperative Congressional Election Study. Okay, I'm going to pause. Finally, Boyer and Leland conducted a study with similar aims to present research. They collected data via the 2016 cooperative. I'm going to go ahead and stop. As you can see, because I could just sit here and read all night. We don't want that. But as you can tell, when they were doing their literature review, they're talking about how they found the people, what they were interested in. They wanted to know about socially supportive behaviors, what their findings were, that they were more socially supportive in some areas and not in others. I mean, so the literature review is letting the reader kind of giving the reader the snapshot. Think of a trailer to a movie, right? This is, if you know the entire movie, how do you describe it in 4 minutes? Well, this is a person that's done research and they're trying to describe to you all the different full-featured movies they've seen in just a few sentences. And that's kind of a good example for a literature review. So when you're writing your introduction sections, kind of keep a mental checklist or even a checklist. For the introduction sections themselves, you want to remember to start with a broad topic or problem. You want to narrow it down. You want to become more specific and more focused. And eventually you're kind of funneling it into your research question. And hopefully you've painted a good picture as to why that research question is important. Once you've given your research question, you want to discuss your hypotheses, both the null and the alternative. And then you want to present your literature review. You want to be sure to avoid the fluffy talk, all the transitions and the common sayings. We don't like the little colloquialisms. You can drop a lot of the additionally. You want to get right to the point. And one way that you can do this, and it's something that I learned long ago, and I didn't realize how much I could do this. It was kind of fun to do this for the first few years. You can delete unnecessary words by removing one word from every sentence, and delete unnecessary sentences by removing one sentence from every paragraph. And you would be surprised at how many extra words we actually say when we write or when we speak. That's a great, great, great thing to do. So just every time you write something, and then go back and pull out one word from every sentence and one sentence from every paragraph. And it will really, really improve the more direct communication. Use active verbs, not passive verbs, and always, always, always cite your resources. And just some tips for the APA format. You're going to start the section with the title of your paper, because this is the introduction and this is the start of the paper, and we don't use the word introduction. We actually write the title of the paper bold and centered. Best to keep it in Times New Roman 12. Be sure and indent your paragraphs, and remember to double space with no additional space between paragraphs and headings, and use correct headings, because that will also help with the organization and presentation of your paper. And I hope this helps, guys. Sorry it's not riveting, but this is some important stuff to learn. So thanks so much for listening, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.